Hi, guys. Okay, I think I'm going to get started just because I have already probably tried to fit too much into this presentation. So I want to make sure we can get the most out of our time. My name is Erin Abler, and I work as lead content designer for the city of Philadelphia. One of the things that's interesting about my job, and there are many, is that I think we are pretty sure that there may only be a couple of other official content designers working for municipalities in the United States right now. So I feel pretty privileged to be part of impacting this area. To be honest with you, even though I have been working in content strategy and information architecture and user research for the past 5 years in digital advertising environments, the first time I'd ever even heard the term content designer was probably in January when I was first finding out about this job. And the term, as far as I know, is mostly originating from the UK. So you've probably already heard in some of the other sessions about government digital service and the great work that they've done in order to try and make web services much simpler and easier to use for people in the UK. They are the ones who came up with the term content designer, to the best of my knowledge. But if you go to their website, and they do have a section, what is content design? And it looks like they kind of struggled with this in the same way I have, which is that it's more about kind of a process than it is about a thing or really kind of readily making it a very kind of simple thing to understand. So what I'll do is just kind of try and take a stab at this. This is not gov.uk approved. But I would say that content design for me is the practice of shaping information to help people take action. I really want to emphasize that it is a practice. It's something that you need to be doing. It's not kind of a product. And the reason I say that is that for me, it's really kind of a crossroads between a couple of areas that I have come to view in my previous line of work as distinct. And those are content strategy, which is kind of the planning for the optimal use of content, and copywriting, which is, of course, actually creating the content and the text and whatever else needs to be supported for the information you're putting out there. So, terrible examples of content are rife in government. And I just wanted to bring one up because it was actually hard to choose among examples. But I thought, if one thing is really, really easy to relate to, I think it's if you have a definite need and you know that you have a problem and you're looking for the solution, it's really tough when you're starting to find information and almost too much information and you don't really know what it's trying to tell you. So I'm going to put you through the brutality of actually reading this, okay? Medicaid, this is about eligibility. Apply if you are aged 65 years or older, blind or disabled, and have low income and few resources. Apply if you are terminally ill and want to receive hospice services. Apply if you are aged, blind, or disabled, live in a nursing home, and have low income and limited resources. Apply if you are aged, blind, or disabled and need nursing home care, but can stay at home with special community care services. Apply if you are eligible for Medicare and have low income and limited resources. So if any of you guys can kind of summarize that for me and tell me whether somebody you know who's 65 years or older falls into this category immediately, that's pretty impressive. So the problem is government content is confusing. And this is what people basically come to government websites expecting. It's repetitive. How many times in there did we hear the word apply? We know that we're trying to find out information about applying. Government content is hard to read. Even halfway through that, I'm kind of thinking, didn't I already read this information about being blind or disabled? Is this some other kind of eligibility piece? I'm not really sure where I am. So what that really adds up to is people are going to equate government content with bad content. And that's a problem for us. Why should we care? There are some really big reasons that are pretty, I think, easy to understand, but not necessarily that easy to break down without kind of going through them. So, first of all, it really affects the quality of our services. If people can't understand the things that we're trying to tell them, how can we expect them to fill out an application correctly? How can we expect to be able to give them the things that we are offering to them? It also affects our bottom line, and I think that this is something that people don't think about very much when it comes to content. But I'm going to show an example in just a minute about somebody trying to figure out how to pay a water bill online. If people can't figure out what they owe, when they're supposed to pay it, how much it is, then we potentially have situations where we're not collecting the amount of revenue that we should be, or where we are inadvertently, charging people money for things that they can't afford. It also affects whether or not people trust us. So if I want you to understand something, I am going to speak to you generally clearly. I'm going to try and give you things in steps. I'm going to make sure that you understand. If I don't really care whether you understand, or even worse, if I'm trying to mislead or confuse you, then I start to speak in this really abstract way, and people detect that right away. And finally, it affects our ability to do our job. If somebody can't figure out what day their trash needs to be picked up, we can't pick up their trash. It's pretty straightforward in a lot of situations, and really kind of goes back to affecting the quality of our services. So as an example, I wanted to show you something that Lauren, who's here in the room, our analytics guru with the City of Philadelphia, we have been using a tool called Hotjar to collect sessions for some areas where we know that there are trouble spots happening on our city websites. So you may think you're missing something right now, but this goes on for about 4.5 minutes, and it's really somebody trying to do the same thing, and over coming across barriers because they're encountering repetitious labels, but not the information that they need in order to actually proceed to make that payment. So over and over, pay a water bill. Yes, I would like to. Okay, here's information about paying it. Payment information. Pay a water bill. Repeat. Hotjar. Great tool. We've also used it for polls on sites. So how do we fix this? One of the things that I've found in my previous work in content strategy with agencies, and also now, but definitely then too, is that it's often a misconception that one of the first places that you start is with the visual design. It's pretty easy to understand why that's the case, because a lot of these websites have very inconsistent look and feel. The colors are some kind of vestige of 1990s style. And there's navigation all over the place. There are definitely things that need to be addressed. But one quote that I think is handy to keep in mind actually comes from Jeffrey Zellman, who founded A List Apart. And that's content precedes design. Design without content isn't design, it's decoration. So if we are putting together some kind of structure and then expecting to fit content into it, over and over and over, we're going to not only end up running into the same problem that we have before, but exacerbating it. Still, again, I think it's kind of understandable. You look at something like this, which is, it's okay that you can't see it up close. It's a page from our Department of Public Health. And it says at the top, Division of Chronic Disease Prevention. And it goes into some detail about chronic diseases being the leading cause of death of people in Philadelphia and the US. It says a few things about what the Department of Public Health does. And then it lists specific initiatives that the Public Health Department is doing. This page is one that I navigated to by going to the Department of Public Health their homepage, clicking on services, finding chronic health or chronic disease issues in one of their list of services, and then I arrive here where they're telling me about the department. So it's tough because there's so much complexity involved in this. not only are we kind of taking this from the department perspective, find out more about what we are doing. Not sort of what you can do or things that we can provide you, but thinking very much like we go to work, we do things for the public. And the complexity that you see with that navigation, going back 2 steps and coming to this place, and where you start to go out from each of these spots. Fixing this one page isn't going to solve the problem for us. Or for her, she's trying to decide between an apple and a cheeseburger. She's already decided. She doesn't feel good about it, though. It's true. So I would say that I feel pretty strongly that ad hoc rewriting is a crutch and not a solution. I do want to say that I think that crutches are sometimes really necessary, and there are certainly situations where I have used them. If you know that people are going to a particular page or asking for a particular service, and you have a way to quickly fix that, by all means do it. There's no reason that you should delay that because you have a strategy that you're working on in parallel. But at the same time, it's not going to give you the same kinds of results as systemic improvement. And so what I want to give you here today are hopefully some tools to start down that road. Okay. Sorry, I'm thirsty. So, how do we fix this? The first thing is not to panic. It's very tempting to panic. Yes. But really to look at where we can kind of go back time and time again, and those are user needs. We've heard a lot about them in the conference already, that you need to find out what they are, that you need to work towards that. And there are many ways of doing that. I want to do a little bit more than advertise the importance of that. I want to give you guys a little bit in the way of some tools. But first, to harken back to Government Digital Service, they have a list of design principles, and right at the very top, they say start with needs. And the asterisk there after start with needs, I didn't include it here, but it is user needs, not government needs. Important thing to keep in mind. So from that perspective, content design objectives, there are a few that are going to be repeatable in most of the projects that you undertake in order to improve content. The first is to understand user needs. We'll get into that. The second is to organize information more intuitively. Always sounds easier than it is. Then you want to create new content for unmet needs. You also want to be developing an underlying content strategy. That is the fourth item on the list, but by no means is it something that you wait to start to work on. You want to be trying to establish patterns for figuring out how to prioritize content, how to work with departments or whomever your stakeholders are to determine who's going to be making these changes, what kinds of changes there'll be. And that also leads into managing content at every stage. So a very important thing is the sustainability of the strategy that you put into place. If you are kind of helicoptering in and giving people a great solution for a couple of pages or even a whole department site, unfortunately that type of strategy quickly falls apart when people have to then go ahead and maintain it themselves. So in order to understand user needs, you need to conduct user research. A lot of work has been done for me by the little pamphlet that you guys got called User Needs. We all received that, and it gives some great tips on ways that you can conduct pretty lightweight, usable studies with users. But I have listed a few methods that I find to be quite reliable. One is analytics, so be tracking on your websites what actually the traffic looks like, what types of patterns you're able to see, and if you can, get yourself a Lauren, a data scientist, because one thing that I really, really respect about data, and a lot of you guys have this knowledge as it is, but there's a lot of complexity to it, and you can really You can misread it easily. You will have departments that misunderstand what they're seeing in trends. So if you're able to kind of get that started as soon as possible and watch the change happen and see what kinds of ebbs and flows there are, you're better equipped to then make changes that actually matter. If you can conduct user interviews, even short ones, do that. People who are your users or who are even kind of like your users can give you a lot of insights into things that you never would have thought about. They will use terms that you don't, and just generally, it's kind of a pleasure to work with them. Task analysis is it's a little bit harder to bring people in for that because it kind of tends to involve sitting them down at a computer, giving them something to do, and then asking them to talk through what it is they're doing and thinking about. But it's extremely valuable for seeing pain points and for trying to understand the way that people are thinking about what they're trying to accomplish. And then last, we also have surveys. Variety of different ways to do those. Again, we've used Hotjar just to conduct simple polls. So even putting one question out there and collecting qualitative input has been very useful for us. Then you can move into creating something called user needs stories. There are a few different ways to structure this, and this is actually also something that you can see laid out in that user needs pamphlet. But it's kind of a statement that's broken down into 3 parts. And the first is, you're looking at a certain type of user, trying to identify that. I need to, and listing the task or action, kind of that specific thing that they need to accomplish, so that I can, and then we're talking about the larger thing that they need to do. So this translates into questions. Who is this for? What will help this person reach their goal? And what is that larger thing that the user needs to accomplish? It's a pretty granular way of looking at things, but it also starts to help you see with a lot more clarity who it really is that you're serving and where you might see crossover between maybe different user types, but giving them a solution that's going to work even across user types, you'll just start to see patterns emerging. So as a homeowner, and this is actually related to something we're working on now, I need to know how much real estate tax I owe so that I can make a payment. Okay, also tax related. As a small business owner, I need to know which taxes I'm required to pay so I don't get in trouble for not paying them. Now see, it says so I don't get in trouble for not paying them. When we actually worked with the Department of Revenue, their way of phrasing this was to avoid or to stay compliant with their tax liabilities. It's not the way that people think about that. And then last, as a low-income resident, I need to find affordable tax counseling so that I can prepare my tax return correctly. So I've brought 3 stories for you guys because I want to show you a way to prioritize them. This is not the only way to prioritize them, I will caveat. Again, leaning on gov.uk, just because they've done a great job with what they're doing. They have some scoping rules that they've set out in order to try and determine what things they're going to tackle. So one question that they ask is, do people want this? This referring to the service or the information that we're able to provide. 2, can people reasonably expect us to meet this need? Is this something that we're going to be undertaking a whole initiative to do, or is it something that's already in our wheelhouse? Can only government meet this need? Really, really critical question. Because if only government can meet this need, government has to meet this need. 4, is it explaining someone's rights or obligations? Again, this is a critical area where people need an unbiased source of information. So if they need to really find out what are my rights or what do I have to do, they should be getting that from somebody who is a disinterested party. And last, is it transactional or encouraging a shift to digital by default government services? And one of the reasons that gov.uk GDS has highlighted that is that they want to make sure that they're establishing a pattern where people are really moving in the direction of making all of these things more available online, so that that really is the default. So I've created a little grid, and for the prioritization, I've got the stories up here. And then for each one of those scoping rules, I've got an area where you can mark a check or not. This top one, as a homeowner, I need to know how much real estate tax I owe so I can make a payment. People want that. We know that from having talked to them. We can meet this need. It's definitely something that government has in terms of available information. Only government provides this. So other people may be pulling this information, but they're getting it from government. It explains their rights or obligations. That's true. They're telling you how much you owe. And it is transactional. So with what the system we're working with, you can find out how much you owe, and then it leads you directly to the opportunity to make that payment. So I won't go through all of these in as much detail, but just as an example for comparison, the next story about the small business owner who needs to know what taxes they need to pay. Pretty much all of the other criteria apply, but we're providing information kind of as a baseline, and so it's not necessarily transactional or digital by default. We can provide that information technically in other ways, and they can also, of course, it's not the same as paying that tax, but still important. And then finally, as a low-income resident, I need to find affordable tax counseling so I can prepare my tax return correctly. People want this. We could meet this need, but it's not the case that only government provides this. It's not a situation where we are needing to explain something that people can really only find out from us. And it's not transactional in the sense that people are going to need to come to our site in order to do it. In fact, it's going to be more useful in the particular case I'm thinking of to direct people to a service that provides this that is not actually offered by the Department of Revenue. So, what I want you to think about in terms of the prioritization is that well-designed content turns a need into an action. So if we've decided what our priorities are, really how are we going to figure out what content we need in order to make those needs met? A few tips for meeting a need. You want to be specific, so be informative and not descriptive. By that, I mean think more about providing instructions than sort of going on at length about the need for what's being done or what the background of it is. Keep to the point. And be clear about what comes next. I can't kind of say enough that really keeping an eye on the actionability and making sure that people know what they need to do next is key, even if you're providing background information. All right, so I'm going to show you guys an example from our Office of Emergency Management. We have been working with them to revise some of their content on our site, alpha.phila.gov, which I encourage you to visit. So starting out from that concept of a user need. One of the user needs that we came up with when working with the the Office of Emergency Management. As someone potentially affected by a future emergency, I need to know what to do so that I'm prepared to deal with one if it happens. Simple, but we're making sure that we've hit all those points so we know whether or not it's important for us. So this is what that page that deals with one aspect of this looked like before. You're digging the design, I know it. So I'm going to walk you through a few problems here. Excitement. So at the top of the page, it says what to have. And that's actually the label that somebody probably would have gotten to this page by clicking on, just because that's how they've kind of tended to use this as a theme. What to have in your home. So it's interesting that this is actually broken up into 2 lines, because typically they think of that as one thing. But then underneath that, and in the same font weight, seeming to be part of the same phrase, it says be able to shelter in place for up to 3 days. Okay. Being able to shelter in place and what to have in your home are related, but they're not the same thing, and it's kind of confusing to come to this spot and see both of those things kind of mashed up. You're not exactly sure, really, am I in the right place? What am I trying to do again? Another problem. Right up in the top, we've talked about sheltering in place. What is sheltering in place? Sheltering in place, this says, is an effective way to protect yourself and your family in many emergencies involving contaminated air. Okay, I'm scared already. For some emergencies, officials may instruct you to stay where you are. This could be as simple as remaining at home while emergency personnel clear hazards from the area. Notice that they have not actually said what sheltering in place is. They've said it's effective. They've said that officials might tell you to stay at home. What is sheltering in place? There are also different descriptions that are covering the same subject. So lower down on the page, there's a little graphic that shows what might go into your shelter-in-place kit. But the actual details that are listed to the left of this give you more tips about kind of maintaining your kit. They're saying store enough supplies for everyone in your home, including pets, for at least 3 days. Keep it in a place that's easy to reach. Tell people not to eat the candy out of it until there's an emergency, things like that. And then lower down, it actually says items for your shelter-in-place kit. Okay, so this is what we probably came to this page for, and it's all the way down here. And finally, indirectly related content is what's taking up the majority of the page right here. So if you must shelter in place, here are the things you need to do. Stay calm, listen to this radio station, wait for updates. Again, not telling us about what to have in your home. So, in order to address this and to take into account the user need, again, somebody who is potentially affected by an emergency, what can I do in order to make sure that I'm prepared to deal with one? So what we did was change the emphasis pretty radically from what was done before. So we want to make it actionable. Overall, people are trying to prepare for an emergency. So why not give them a section called Prepare for an Emergency and break down the steps that are required in order to do that? One of those steps is to make a shelter-in-place kit. And we do end up calling it that because it's a term that's used pretty widely by different offices in the government. But we offer a plain language description of shelter in place instead of just expecting people to understand what that is. So here we say shelter in place is another way of saying stay inside. It's a way to keep safe during some kinds of emergencies, etc. We've consolidated the repetitive content, so instead of having a list of different items kind of split up into a descriptive element and some bullet points, we've actually just kind of taken the bullet points, slimmed that down, and included it here. And then finally, it is important to know what you need to do if you're sheltering in place. So we didn't want to get rid of that information entirely, but we did move that content, being related as it is, to its own subsection. So it's stay informed. Okay. Any questions about that at all, real quick? Oh. Okay, sure. I will answer that very quickly. We are not against using imagery, but we want to make sure that when we do, it's something that's going to be supporting the content. So if it's not necessary, then right now we're staying away from it. We're still in the early stages of developing our kind of structure for figuring out the sourcing for images, figuring out how we track that, make sure the departments or whomever it is who's providing it to us, that we have the right to use it. So we probably will be using more images, but that's kind of a couple reasons why you're not seeing it right now. Same question?
Because it's easier for me to look at the page and I can visualize what do I need to have in my shelter.
Great.
So it would be good to visually show me instead of me. I think reading is harder than just seeing an image and say, oh, I can match this image with whatever I have in my home and see if there's an efficiency. So images would be perfect instead of having the bullet points written.
Yes. Do you want a job? No, but that really is, that's a perfect explanation. Thank you both for bringing that up, because there are some ways to present information that are going to be more effective and more immediate to people, and we definitely want to pursue those. We do have a ton of limitations, unfortunately, in just the amount of things that we have to try and fix. And so we're hoping to, get to that point where we are getting to what we know we can do and what we think is really best to improving something and getting it to a spot where we feel good about it generally. Yep.
But I think what you said earlier is a huge nugget in terms of strategy, right? So before we start just taking stuff because we think it's going to help, let's really set in place standards about what we can do moving forward, so that we're all on the same page in terms of copyright and how we choose those images. So it totally makes sense to take your time now, so that when you go forward, you can move much quicker.
Absolutely.
I know a spin off to that is how do you measure that you actually improve things for users?
Great question. I am going to try and get to that in the course of this. Bring it up again if I don't get to it. Last one?
How did the Homeland Security, they do emergency management, sorry, how did they take this because it's their precious baby and now you just chopped it up?
Yeah. I could take a separate hour to talk about dealing with the departments, but it's a very, very good question. In this particular case, they were so receptive to working with us, and I had the good fortune of coming into a situation where my colleagues, Kyle, who's in the room over here, and Aaron, who's in the back, had already done a lot of outreach to different departments about trying to move forward with this initiative. So they had been prepped for the idea that something new was coming, and what we've been trying to do is share with them and reiterate the way that those things are changing. So they did actually have some resistance to some of the new information architecture, but we always have a reason for doing it, and we always are able to go back to user needs. Okay. So, great questions. So how do we clean up content? Okay. I've asked this question, and I don't actually really mean to answer it because I don't like it. To me, revision is really about creation. It might just need to be incremental creation. And the best ways to revise content are also going to be the best ways to create it. What do I mean by that? So in the previous example, I was showing you how we had some existing content available, and it had the potential to meet user needs, but it wasn't doing that. What we want to do is take that as a source, if we can, and work with the subject matter experts to then change something or create something, really, that is based on the same information, but is entirely new in its structure and much, much better in terms of its effectiveness. So I wanted to offer some tips just in terms of writing for online reading. And I do think that it ties into this because whether you're taking something that already exists or you're uncovering something that right now government is not meeting as a need, I think that you can apply these same principles. So one thing that people do online is scan content. They don't read it in detail. There was a study that Jacob Nielsen wrote about years back that showed that people really only read about 28% of text on a page. As you increase the amount of text, that number tends to go down. And again, the reason is that people are looking for information that is relevant to them. And if you're just kind of overwhelming them with a bunch of details straight off, they don't really know whether or not it's for them yet, and they're not going to read all the way through it in order to determine that. So in order to support scanning, you can use headings. It helps a lot to break up content. Break lists into bullet points when you can. And use sentence case, not all caps. That is something that we've been encountering a little bit of difficulty with our departments not understanding that in order to make something appear more important, you change the hierarchy of the page or you talk about it differently. You don't just shout. So related, I also wanted to share, this is something that those who are content wonks will have seen before, but people tend to scan in a certain kind of pattern online. So these are heat maps that show different types of content pages. Over here we have a content detail page, and we've got a page that has visuals with supporting content, and then we have a search results page. All of them have a sort of F pattern. So readers in the West tend to kind of scan down the page, back up across the headings, and down across the headings, looking for...
Using Hotjar?
That's not what this is, but you can use Hotjar for that, yeah. Yep. So related to that, put the important stuff first. You know, put out there what people are already looking for. They're going to decide for themselves if they want more detail, and they will seek that. So put your important information in the first couple of paragraphs. I don't mean try and cram everything about the topic up there, but do show people right away, here's what this is about, here's what you can expect. Also, start subheadings, bullet points, and paragraphs with words that are information carrying, as Nielsen likes to say. So instead of saying, in order to find the nearest polling place, you say, find polling place, or polling places. Use white space. So cramped pages make it really hard to tell what content is actually important, and it's hard to scan and therefore less likely to be read. So online, keep most paragraphs 2 to 3 sentences long. It seems really strange if you're used to writing in the print world, but it actually works well online. And then if you can, work with a visual designer or somebody who has a background or an eye for these things to create a more intuitive visual flow. So, you know, making sure that you're not just breaking things up, but that you're also helping people's eye kind of go down a page in a way that's going to help them locate the most important information. Use active voice. So people want to be spoken to, not at. And one way that we can kind of make it more actionable as well is to say, you know, you can create a community garden in your neighborhood instead of community gardens can be created in neighborhoods with permission of the land bank. It's also human nature to be impatient. You know, if you're talking about something, it is recommended that people take shelter before the storm. Well, you're kind of waiting until halfway through the sentence to get to the actual information, and that's not that interesting to read. So point there being name the doer before the thing being done. Also, talk like a human. This doesn't mean that you need to treat it like your social media venue, but you can and should avoid bureaucratic language that doesn't really serve a purpose to users, and make sure that you're providing context when offering an unfamiliar term or something, a process that people are unlikely to understand. There's also a nice general rule of thumb. You can't always hit it, but to aim for an 8th grade reading level when you're writing, and 5th or 6th grade when possible. How do you know if you're writing at an 8th grade reading level? There's this great tool called readabilityscore.com. And in the area where they allow you to enter text, which you can actually just go ahead and copy and paste and drop it right in there, I have put the sentence aim for an 8th grade reading level, 5th or 6th grade when possible. And what they'll do is instantly return a score based on several different criteria that give you kind of a between 0 and 100 where your rating is. So 89.5 is pretty good. And then down below, it tells you a few different types of scales for determining what grade level that's at. And it looks like we're at about the 5th or 6th grade level. Another thing is to fight complexity. So long and complicated phrases are going to be more difficult to understand, take more concentration. And if you're kind of padding content with unnecessary details, it's really not helping people because, again, we want to help them take action. So if you can, shorten your sentences. 15 words or fewer, I think it's a nice rule of thumb. Aim to instruct or explain, as I mentioned before, so not to describe. Finally, if you have the opportunity and the resources, as we've been talking about. This should be part of your content strategy plan. Excuse me, to choose the format purposely. So text is not always going to be the best way to help somebody do something or to help somebody understand something. And that's great, actually, because as human beings, we take in information in a lot of different ways. So if we can make processes and transactions interactive, do it. If you have the opportunity to use digital forms to collect information instead of making people print out a PDF, do that. And then finally, don't use random stock photos, even if they have a great picture of a lady with an apple and a cheeseburger. Try to make those visuals meaningful. Okay, so how can we tell whether it works? That's a really tough question, so I appreciate that it came up. I don't have the answer, but here's my fake answer. I've come up with kind of a rough grading rubric and have borrowed heavily from existing things in the educational world. And I would walk you through each of these individually, but I don't think we're going to have enough time. What I'll do is I'll try and make this available to you guys, excuse me, as soon as possible on SlideShare. You can follow my Twitter handle too. But basically, I've kind of broken this down into what parameters you can look for in content. This is, subjective, but if something is consistently clear, concise, and direct, if it's based on an identifiable user need, uses appropriate tone, all those great things, if you actually get to that point, you can rate that content an A, and it kind of devolves from there, okay? So C-level content is meeting basic requirements, but there are also going to be things that you notice that are wrong about it or not helping people. And then when you get into the D to F area, you're talking about stuff that is actually likely to mislead people, cause confusion or problems. And so that is definitely stuff you want to prioritize addressing as long as it meets user needs. So I will skip through these. Okay. I have a couple of examples for you. So the state of California actually, a little while back, took it upon itself to revise its jury instructions. So they had noticed that there was a great deal of difficulty people were having when trying to understand what their obligations were as a juror, and this had a lot to do with the way that this stuff was written. So one of these jury instructions was this phrase: failure of recollection is common. Innocent misrecollection is not uncommon. Which sounds like a failed philosopher wrote it. It's hard to even tell at first whether it's repetitious or not. But for sure, it is written in a way that can be a lot clearer. Their rewriting, I think, turned this to an A. People often forget things or make mistakes in what they remember. So much clearer, so much easier to understand why it would be important if you're sitting on a jury and listening to that. Okay. A preponderance of the evidence. So you might hear this on court shows, but there was actually a study that was done that was related to this that I think it was like 50% of people couldn't really interpret what that meant. And in fact, the majority understanding was that this meant a slow and careful pondering of the evidence. Okay. Which, it's sense-making, right? If you don't recognize a word, the thing that sounds familiar is pondering. You think, okay, pondering evidence, makes sense. So interestingly, and maybe due to the fact that they were sensitive to that statistic, I actually think that where they went with their rewriting falls a little short of the mark. They say more likely than not. I think that we kind of lost something in that translation. It doesn't mention evidence. It doesn't talk about the relationship of, assumption to fact. And there has to be another way to do that. It may even be as simple as saying a majority of the evidence. So for that, it got a C. Okay. So a brief guide to writing well. This is where I emphasize that you don't usually get it right on the first try. Write something, really anything. Walk away from it. Give yourself a little bit of space. with your Fitbit, it might be 4 hours. I don't know. If you're active, come back to it. Take stock of things that you might be able to improve and revise it. You're not done yet. You need to have somebody else read it, preferably someone who's going to give you an honest opinion. Revise it again. Then, whether this means publishing it or putting it out for more people to read and not the public, have a lot of people read it and get their feedback. Get data on it if you can. See if there are incidents like we saw with the water bill, where people are confused, where they bounce from the page. Try and track their paths through the site to see if they're encountering something that they expected to see or not. And be willing to change based on that information. So revise it again. And maybe again. So just to reiterate a few key points. Ad hoc rewriting, in my opinion, is a crutch and not a solution. I think that well-designed content focuses on turning a need into an action. That action can be learning. It's not always doing something by clicking, etc., but it is an action. And the best ways to revise content are also the best ways to create it. Finally, to improve, seek feedback. Well, not finally. So don't just make content better, make better content. Okay, I will take some questions. Thank you. Yes.
I wonder if you've gone down the path of encoding some of the user needs, like user stories, into the content management system, or things like that, where some of the pre-work that doesn't actually end up being metadata or shown on a page anywhere, but just something to help frame people's thinking about what they're doing.
Explain a little bit more, because I think I really like that idea, but I feel like you have it in your head in a way that I would love to know more about it.
Maybe, so, I'm a content contributor, and I show up at the page, and I have to fill in a blank for, as a blank, I need to blank so that I can.
Right.
Have you had any experience with that, or anything else?
I encourage people to write like that. We're having our team members write like that, but it's actually really interesting to think about embedding that so closely with the content. I'd be interested in exploring that if it's something that you've done or would like to help me figure out, especially with departments. I mean, we've had workshop situations where we were walking them through this and they really got it. They felt like they did. They said, "Wow, I'm able to make that connection now from those stories." Megan?
Well, a comment. I don't know if you're creating content right in the CMS or what other people are doing, but there's a couple tools that you can use to build that kind of stuff. You can't build it into your CMS, so gather content is one, where you can build out page outlines, basically, and that's the kind of thing that you could plug right into there. And then if you're low tech, like a lot of my clients are, we just do it in a Word document, but we have at the top of every page that we're creating. This is the
Perfect. Yep.
stories that this content supports.
Thank you for reminding me. Gather Content is a great tool. It lets you kind of outline what you need to create according to potential page templates that you've created, but be creating the content separate and then migrate it into the system when you're ready.
Talk about how City of Philadelphia decided who gets story content.
Oh boy. That's something we are still really, really working hard on figuring out. Right now, we are a small team that's taking on a huge, huge task, to say the least. But I think that we've kind of been going back and forth a little bit with how much we want to engage our department collaborators. They are, as I mentioned before, they're the subject matter experts, and we want their knowledge and we want their contribution, and they're absolutely pivotal to be, keeping involved. And ultimately, when it comes to maintaining the content, they're the ones who are going to know when an update needs to happen. They're the ones who are going to let us know when, some new rules come out and we need to update. So I think that there's a really tricky balance between using resources that you have and that you're able to train and trust, and then going out and sharing that knowledge with people is so important, because I really think you need as many advocates as you can on the ground in those situations. But to be honest with you, not everybody can do this stuff. It's a specialty, like anything. And so I think you have to try and look for people who are going to be good partners and, work on that training. Absolutely do that. But as to the extent to which we can rely on that for all departments, it's a little bit still up in the air.
Two questions. I just tried to follow you on Twitter. I'm not sure if you're holding a cat.
I am holding a cat. I know the cat looks unhappy. I should change it. Cat looks unhappy.
In terms of the last bit about the visual, using visuals, I believe that, I don't know what the experience is like. So where I'm from, Jamaica, we have some government services that I believe could be explained visually. But what has been your experience in terms of framing, I need to get to a safe place whenever there's a storm. Is it better to give a visual to say, run out the door, get here, and how is that visual impact measured in terms of the content that we produce?
I don't know the answer to your question, but users will.
Okay.
So if you can, look into kind of having some of those face-to-face conversations with people, or creating some survey that maybe puts those different ways of producing the information out there and ask people to compare them. I would say try that. I think it differs by community and culture and needs, and I would be interested to hear what you find out.
It's just that I believe, because for me, I'm like a straight up. Just give it to me straight away. So a lot of times you will have a 12-step process that if it's visualized, then that 12-step process
Sure.
would be easier for the common person at the 8th grade level.
Sure.
To kind of visualize and say, this is what I need to get done, and the impact or the buy-in will be greater if you choose that route instead of having to read through these things and they may not understand. But if you can make it digestible into the images, fill out form, do this, do that, it is much better that way.
It's a great point, and video can be very powerful there as well.
I actually have thought about that a lot too, because in visually communicating data, it's also thinking about like user needs for this kind of work too. It's like I've thought about, is it possible to do almost like a parallel track, right? So the user rides on the train. If they're a visually oriented person, then they might go down that path. If they're textually oriented, they learn by reading. Then maybe there's like some method of choice for them to consume in the format that they're most comfortable. It's just, I don't know.
I think I saw the one in the back. Is that Jack?
I think in this city we like to think we're all like special snowflakes. But I'm curious, what do you think the potential is for creating a templatized, what are the needs for like a parking tickets page that could be used across the country? Do you think that it's specific to every city, or can we start generalizing the good writing in all of our cities?
Well, I have a feeling, it's not much more than that, that there probably is some potential for that, for creating templates or basic structures that could be applied in many situations. And in fact, there may be something that translates well enough that it could be applied to many types of transactions and not just sort of parking in Philadelphia, parking in San Francisco, et cetera. I don't know. There are so many exceptions, but I kind of feel like if you figure out a way to manage the exceptions, with this certain kind of area where you're sort of like, okay, here's the complexity and here's what we might need to ask, and versus kind of having that template and knowing what you can rely on and the steps you need to put in there, I think there's good potential for that.
I think some of that is maybe not in governments, but already happening with things like schema.org, where you've got schemas for
Right.
things that are common, like recipes kit.
Yeah.
Exactly the same in the ingredients and instructions. And I wonder if there's some opportunity, some of those really core functions of government.
Right, so I don't know if you guys all heard that, but Megan was mentioning that there are some options that examples already out there, like on schema.org, where I will call them formats just for the sake of convenience. But if you want to, say recipes, there's a pretty standard way to do that, and a pretty effective way to do that. So maybe there's something parallel that we could start to create.
That's also can be tied to your analytics too, because by sort of complying with that, then it gives like SEO and your search results can be optimized by employing the markup that the crawlers are looking for like structured data. Yeah. I'm okay.
Okay. 3 minutes, guys. Anything else? You've had.
Create a template for other departments to kind of provide content?
So right now we're in the process of kind of creating those templates as we go, as need dictates. So what you saw with the example with the Office of Emergency Management, where we have a page and there's kind of a sub menu on the side, that actually was something that didn't exist before we started to work with them. And we realized, we just needed a simple way to be able to break down something that involve steps or involve closely related content. It's in some ways it's something that exists ubiquitously across the internet, but we didn't really have it in our portfolio, so to speak. So what we're trying to do is anticipate the areas of greatest need and address those first. And so we're kind of creating things as we go. Yeah.
I just have a trick to suggest for writers, which is to make your writing environment match the publishing environment as best you can. And what I mean by that is if you pop open Word, you're basically everything in the interface and in the margins, the font size is telling you to write on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And that's not what you're publishing. If you're writing for the web, you're like using narrower columns, larger fonts, things like that. And so if you can kind of move the other direction and basically like make your editor look more like the place that you're publishing, that'll encourage you to write in a way that works for that. And in particular, one of the biggest things it does, I think, is that it causes you to write shorter sentences.
Mm-hmm. You see what it's going to look like.
because like a 40-word sentence doesn't look that big in Word, but then you put it in a blog and it looks like.
Good point. Yeah, very good point. Okay.
Gather content.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know I wanted to offer, and I was like, should I give them a free plug again? I don't know. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for coming, and I'll be up here if you have any other questions.